All right, I will start in the meantime. Good afternoon. My name, as the slide now says, is John Deni. I'm a research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute, really the research arm, as many of you know, of the U.S. Army War College. And because I am a government employee, and even though we have academic freedom, I must say the views I'm going to express are mine and mine alone, and do not reflect those of the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So hopefully these comments won't get me fired. I am going to talk about conventional deterrence and conventional defense. And I'm going to take a stab at the question posed for this panel, how do forward deployed forces support broader deterrence and defense objectives? Now, before I begin the presentation, for those of you that are, I've got some photos in my brief slide package. In the greatest tradition of the Pentagon, I've got a very succinct 85-slide presentation for you. It's not that long, but there are photos here, and I've asked the organizers not to portray those either in live filming or recording or in the still photos. And so those of you that may be on Twitter, General Hetherington, I'm really looking at you, I guess, sir. Please don't tweet out any of my photos. Okay? Okay. So with that out of the way now, I will... I am deterred. Thank you. So I'm going to take a stab at this question of how the forward presence right now, the conventional forward presence, contributes to deterrence and defense. As many of you know, back at the Warsaw Summit in 2016, the Alliance approved a new presence posture for NATO, that is the Enhanced Forward Presence, or EFP. And since about the middle of last year, early to middle last year, the Alliance has been implementing that EFP concept. Enhanced Forward Presence basically amounts to what NATO terms a battle group. It's sort of a reinforced battalion, 1,000 troops more or less, in each of the Baltic States and Poland. There are framework countries leading each of these, the UK leading in Estonia, the Canadians obviously in Latvia, the Germans in Lithuania, and the Americans leading in Poland. And all told, we have about 18 or 19 NATO allies contributing in one form or another to this new form of forward presence, and that's fairly significant. In fact, EFP itself is fairly significant. It is the first time since the end of the Cold War that NATO has based, even if only on a rotational basis, and most of, but not all, most of these forces, these units, these capabilities are there rotationally deployed. That is anywhere from 6 to 9 months, and then they go back to their home countries. And a new unit is sent over, heel-to-toe rotations. So it's the first time, though, that NATO has based or stationed any troops east of the inner German border. And so this is a fairly significant accomplishment for NATO, and it represents a real serious strengthening of the alliance's deterrence and reassurance posture. So let me address some of the, before I address the strengths and weaknesses, actually, let me highlight some of the things I saw on a field trip, a research trip I took to some of these EFP locations about 2 months ago. Have any of you, first let me ask you, any of the Canadian officers or other allied military officers in the room, have any of you been to or been stationed in one of these locations on a rotation? Okay, sir, in 3 words or less, can you describe what life is like there, what the existence of the facilities is? Okay. What's your assessment of the facilities? Growing. That is a good word. Definitely growing. You might also say a little rough. Lots of construction going on. Work in progress. These things continue to unfold even up to the current date. So these photos were taken back in April. And there's a photo here of the camp at Rukla. You can see there's some permanent buildings being built there, but you can also see they're relying still upon temporary structures. In Adasia and Latvia, again, less than permanent structures built on concrete slabs. Lots of construction going on. Containerized housing units. In some cases, some really nice construction going up. In fact, at least at this location, the Latvians are moving their troops that are at this facility into the older buildings and allowing the Allied troops, the rotationally deployed forces, to take over these new digs. And then finally, most importantly for the Canadian presence in Latvia, there's an ice rink under construction, all courtesy of the Latvian Ministry of Defense. This was a vital stop on the facility tour. So let's take a step back up to the 70,000 foot level. So this is what EFP looks like today. Let's talk about the strengths and some of the weaknesses. You know, I just mentioned, as you can see here, the flags, the NATO placemat is what they call it. This multinationality is, at the strategic level, a major strength, primarily because it spreads risk among the Allies. And in fact, it's not too dissimilar from what the Allies had during the Cold War in the form of the Allied Command Europe, or ACE, Mobile Force Land. The ACE, Mobile Force Land, was a quick reaction force that was designed largely to be used on the flanks of NATO, so think Turkey and Norway. But the only time it was about to be used, it was actually going to be used in Central Europe in 1968 in response to the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. In any case, that unit, the ACE Mobile Force Land, had, I believe, 14 representatives or personnel from 14 of, at that time, the 16 NATO allies. So again, an effort to spread risk among all the allies through really creating a tripwire, whereby in the worst case scenario, the Russians come across the border in force, there are going to be many allies that take casualties, and that will spur a greater reaction on the part of the alliance in response. That's at least the theory, right? So this is a major strength, this multinationality. This is a good thing. Let me talk now about whether or not this force or these units are really all they're cracked up to be from a combat perspective. NATO characterizes these units as, quote, robust, combat-ready forces, unquote. And here I think there are some significant challenges to be overcome, and I want to highlight for you a couple of those. First, with regard to the multinationality. At the strategic level, it's an asset, right, to have so many allies involved on this tripwire. But with a year of experience now under their belts, the allies are finding in many cases that multinationality at the battalion or battle group level is really difficult to pull off. In fact, in U.S. doctrine, and this is the same for most of our allies, in U.S. doctrine, we don't believe in taking multinationality below the brigade level. But in this case, we have multiple companies, in some cases even smaller units, coming together to form a single battle group. Now, the alliance experimented with some of this in Afghanistan. For example, there was an American company embedded within a Romanian battalion. And that really enabled the Romanians to deploy to Afghanistan in the first place. So it was critical that the Americans were able to do this. But we had serious problems in the combat capability of those battalions. And the Allies are finding that now with regard to EFP. And I'll highlight some of the most significant challenges, of course, are in secure communications. Right? That's a long-standing challenge within NATO, especially as we go down the food chain of units. We've got challenges in terms of equipment compatibility. Those are long-standing in NATO, but again, they get aggravated when we take multinationality to or below the battalion level. There are problems in terms of English language proficiency, and not simply in terms of whether soldiers from these various contributing countries can speak English, but whether they can do so without an accent. Sometimes just trying to discern the accent on the radio is very difficult. And then finally, we've got a problem or a challenge regarding duplicative capabilities. So for example, at one of these EFP units that I visited 2 months ago, I was taken by the medical support area. And there are 5 contributing countries, for example, to this one unit. Guess what? There are 5 different medical units there, each in their own container. All duplicative capability that could in theory be unified, but is not right now. So all these challenges frustrate the effectiveness right now of the EFP battle groups. But even without these interoperability challenges, we also have challenges still in terms of caveats. That's a four-letter word in NATO. We prefer to call them, or they prefer to call them, operational limitations. A much kinder phrasing. But basically that means that this is the expression we use to describe whether and how the contributing forces are enabled to respond to certain crises or certain emergencies, or what they're able to do, kind of rules of engagement, right? So you can imagine that if the Russian forces came across the border in force, the North Atlantic Council, NATO's highest political decision-making body, would meet probably pretty quickly, and they'd say, yea, verily, we vote to authorize some response. If there were an obvious crisis, that's probably what would happen. But in a situation that's potentially more ambiguous, where there aren't tanks coming across the border, but the host nation feels like there is a burgeoning insecurity, there's a burgeoning challenge developing, that country, they may try to exercise this process through the NAC, through NATO, but not receive satisfaction, not receive the positive vote from the NAC. So what are they to do? They'll probably mobilize their national forces, right? But what will these EFP units do? It depends. In interviews I had with some of the various national representatives, it's all over the map. Some are authorized to roll out with the host nation force that they are embedded underneath. Okay, so you can imagine these battalions are all embedded underneath in a command structure, a host nation, a Latvian or a Lithuanian brigade of some kind. Okay, if that brigade goes, in some cases, the EFP unit underneath, we're going too. But in other cases, some of these units, they're going to stand and wait. They're going to wait till they get a call from their capital, and the capital blesses it. So these national caveats could create chaos in terms of whether and how the alliance is able to respond. Finally, there are some command and control challenges that remain to be ironed out. On the one hand, NATO claims that these four battle groups, quote, are under NATO command through the multinational Corps Northeast headquarters in Poland, unquote. On the other hand, if you talk to the battle group commanders, they'll tell you they're embedded, as I mentioned, beneath the brigade commands of their respective host nation forces. So there's a bit of confusion here, quite obviously. So I've taken you on kind of a deep dive in some cases into some of the operational and tactical weeds. I want to step back now and talk more about whether these units are fit for purpose from a strategic perspective. The units are, whether they're trained, equipped, and ready for the big fight is one thing. And I have some doubts that they're really ready for that. But, in spite of their shortcomings, they're really designed and structured and positioned to prepare for or defend against, or deter, I should say, that big fight, right? They're a tripwire force, let's be honest. Now, we can have debates about whether they're big enough. Alex and a coworker, Mike Hunziker, have a monograph coming out from SSI that addresses, among other things, whether they're in the right position, right? The tripwire only works if it's actually in a place where the adversary trips over it. So we can discuss that, but we can say generally, as I mentioned at the outset, this is a major improvement for NATO's posture, its deterrent posture, but it's really designed to defend and deter that big fight. The problem, I think, that most analysts foresee, certainly I see, is that big fight is really unlikely. Most analysts of the security situation in this part of the world, at least those analysts that are west of Poland, don't really think that it's very likely the Russians are going to come across the border in force. What's far more likely are, for example, unattributed cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, fomenting of ethnic, religious, political discord among minority groups like ethnic Russians, information operations, influence operations, right? The gray zone kinds of things that some have spoken about earlier today. These kinds of instability-generating, consensus-breaking activities, most serious analysts of security in this part of the world think are far more likely. And frankly, the EFP units are not manned, trained, equipped, or tasked to help out against those challenges. So in my view, that's the next big challenge for the EFP battle groups. These are the things that have to be addressed by NATO as it moves forward. The EFP battle groups, in sum, and I'll end here, were without a doubt a necessary improvement on NATO's deterrent and defensive posture. However, the great irony is that they are not sufficient to deter or defend against the most likely challenges that our allies are going to face in that part of the world.